everybody, and welcome to this special edition of the Human Physiology video tutorials with me, Dr. Amir Sandhu. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Jamie Macdonald and Dr. Sam Oliver, both of whom are senior lecturers in exercise physiology and high-altitude physiology researchers. Now, they use the altitude chamber that we have at the back here, and they do many field expeditions. So between them, they have a lot of experience about altitude physiology. Now, the purpose of today's tutorial session is to talk about the significant challenges that are faced by individuals who are trekking up Mount Kilimanjaro. We will go through some of the key concerns that one might have, including acute mountain sickness. We will talk about some practical tips that you could make in preparation for climbing Kilimanjaro, as well as some other advice which will be very useful in your preparation. So I want to start first with you, Sam, and I want to ask you firstly about what the specific challenges are of trekking Kilimanjaro, which we know is about 5,895 meters above sea level.
Yeah, well, the challenges start really from the moment you leave your door back in the UK. So travel itself is quite stressful. So the travel getting to the airport, getting on the plane, then when we actually fly into Kilimanjaro, there's a change in time zone, so you may feel some jet lag as well. And then as you get into the trek, there's physically arduous. There's the environmental stresses of extremes of temperature, so you may feel hot in the day, particularly lower down, and then cold in the evening, and more cold as you ascend the mountain. The other environmental stresses that people might come across as well is the solar glare and the UV, and of course taking precautions of wearing correct sunglasses and sunscreen are really important as well. In addition, people, because of all this additional stress, people may be more likely to pick up coughs and colds, which can have a negative effect on their time on going to Kilimanjaro.
Okay, that's really insightful. Now, I'm interested about what you mentioned with the ambient temperature, and I'll come back to you on that. So perhaps, Jamie, if you've got anything you'd like to add as well.
Yeah, so just some specifics about climbing Mount Kilimanjaro itself. It's quite a unique mountain. It's very isolated, which means that there's no opportunity really to acclimatise on surrounding itineraries. You have to be quite clever to try to actually make sure that you acclimatise properly. It's often climbed by charity treks and people who don't have much experience of being at altitude. And then the way that the political situation is, it's actually a national park, and you have to pay to actually be in the park. So that puts a lot of pressure on commercial companies to try to reduce the amount of time that they actually spend on the mountain. And then finally, there's actually limited accommodation available on the mountain, so that makes choosing itineraries quite challenging, and where you're actually going to sleep, and actually trying to stick to the recommendations for climbing and ascending at altitude.
Okay, that's excellent. Now, I do want to come back to you, Sam, particularly about the ambient temperature. Now, throughout the trek, obviously, there's a lot of changes in altitude, and the temperature will vary at each different level of altitude. So, how does an individual regulate their body temperature? For example, when they're too hot, what would they do? And for example, if they suddenly get cold, what would they do? How do you regulate the optimum body temperature?
I think practically the simple thing to consider is the layering of your clothes. So starting with a basic base layer, which has got high wicking properties, maybe a fleece on your top, and then having both waterproof jackets and maybe a down jacket, which is a thick insulating, like a duvet jacket, which people can use when it's particularly cold. And then because use of layers, it allows you to take things off quite easily, put them into your day rucksack that you'd be carrying, and of course having hats and gloves available as well. They'll mean you can keep to a thermally comfortable state throughout the trek.
Okay, fantastic. Very good advice there. Now, one thing which, even for myself, when I'm going up Mount Snowdon locally here, I'm always wondering about how much I should eat and drink, because certainly sometimes you want to eat a lot, but I'm always worried that might be harmful as I'm going up, because you don't normally tend to exercise after having a very big meal, but yet the energy expenditure of trekking up such a mountain is quite high. So what would your advice be about diet and water intake as they ascend up?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Amir. So when people are going up Mount Kilimanjaro, they will be exercising. They will have those thermal stresses, particularly lower down. It actually could be quite warm. So as we would with any increased exercise and physical activity here in the UK on a summer's day, you'd increase probably your food and fluid intake modestly. But I would strongly recommend not to over-drink, so not be drinking excessively. There's some simple things that people can do to try to monitor their fluid intakes. One is to think about their thirst. Do they feel thirsty? And drink to try to prevent them feeling too thirsty. And the other one is to check the colour of their urine. Urine should be clear or a sort of yellowy straw colour. If it becomes darker than that, really, that's a good indicator that people are becoming dehydrated, and I'd recommend increasing their fluid intake. With fluid intake, one of the things people might want to consider is taking like a sports drink, so which is predominantly increasing carbohydrate intake, and that can help with prolonged exercise, and particularly in high altitude environments. One of the things that might happen to people as they ascend higher up the mountain, they may actually start to lose their appetite. And of course, if we don't eat enough, that's going to have lots of negative effects on lethargy and generally feeling like things become more effortful. So having the carbohydrate in the drink, it might be a more palatable way of actually consuming the required energy that they're going to need to do well on the mountain. So I would recommend considering some sport drinks, but make sure you've used this practice before you go, so it's not something that's new when you get up onto the mountain that you then start having difficulties, or you don't like drinking it, for example, and then you don't drink anything. Of course, that would be worse still. So simple messages: check your urine colour, drink to thirst, consider carbohydrates in your drinks because that might be more palatable, and try to keep eating throughout the trek, even when if you start to feel your appetite is starting to be suppressed as you go up, because a number of days without eating, clearly, if we did that at sea level when we're pretty well rested and things are easy, we wouldn't feel great, and that's going to be much worse at high altitude.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Sam. That was a very insightful answer. Now, whenever I've actually gone walking or hiking with Jamie here, he's always been exceptionally organized. He always carries the right amount of equipment. And so I always enjoy going with this guy because it can mean I can turn up with nothing. He'll definitely have something for me. So what I wanted to ask Jamie was, in a typical equipment list for Kilimanjaro, what would you be taking?
I think probably the best advice here is to actually go and utilize experts around you. So there are lots of good mountaineering and equipment shops, and they have lists that are available so that they can actually give you some advice. So for example, if you go into Cotswold, they actually have a kit list recommended for Kilimanjaro. So rather than give specific information about what to put in your pack, do go speak to the experts around you. Try to speak to the people who are actually organising your trek, because they actually may provide some equipment for you. And what you also need to work out is how much of that equipment are you going to be carrying, and how much is going to be being carried for you by porters, or on any trek it could be animals, etc. And once you know that, then you can begin to plan your bag and what you're going to put in it appropriately. A bit like Sam said with food, it's really important that you practice with your equipment. So don't think about buying this equipment the day before you're going to go on the expedition. Try to buy this equipment months in advance and make sure that you get to practice it. And that's especially important with things like boots. And really, some strong recommendations would be to go get an expert fitting. Again, from big companies, they'll do that, like Cotswold, but also your small independent shops will have experts to help you do that. Other things that you might want to put in your kit bag, perhaps some little tips. Think about what you might want in the day and keep those things accessible. So Sam was talking about fluid, making sure that you've got water containers that are going to be accessible and that they're not going to freeze on the final summit day. Making sure you've got food that's handy, like snacks in your pockets, etc. Making sure that you have things that you may forget off your kit list, like some lip salve, some sun cream. Looking after your skin is very important in that high UV environment, as Sam mentioned earlier. And then a couple other things to maybe take out in your big bag with you just to make your trip a bit more comfortable. Think about your sleeping environment. Make yourself as comfortable as possible at night. Do you need to take an eye mask, some earphones, an iPod, a comfy pillow, a nice warm sleeping bag, a sleeping mat? Is there any medical kit that you want to take which is specific to you? Yeah. And things to help with your general hygiene, so making sure you've got some hand washing equipment, some alcohol gel and things like that to try and prevent those coughs and colds that Sam mentioned are a problem at altitude.
Okay, excellent. Very, very detailed, comprehensive answer there from Jamie. So what I really want to move on now is specific questions which are related to high altitude sickness. So in particular, acute mountain sickness or AMS. Now, this is a complication that begins to happen, which I think above 2,500 meters. But yeah, as you start to ascend up, you know, you do start to get the signs and symptoms of AMS. So, Jamie, if I may, if I can start with you, and if you can actually first explain the three main types of high altitude sickness to our viewers at home.
So the first and most common illness that people experience at altitude is acute mountain sickness. And this is a self-limiting condition. What that means is that if you get acute mountain sickness and it's mild or moderate, then it will resolve by itself. Acute mountain sickness is really a condition which is caused by a lack of oxygen and not being able to acclimatise quickly enough and sufficiently enough to that low oxygen environment. So it could occur in our chamber behind us, or it could occur on Mount Kilimanjaro. And the typical symptoms are headache, nausea, if you're sleeping overnight, disrupted sleep, some fatigue. You may see some dizziness. So the symptoms can be from mild, moderate to severe. So that's acute mountain sickness. It's a condition that everyone has probably heard of, but perhaps it actually, as a condition itself, it's quite common at altitude. On Kilimanjaro, it's very common, but typically when we go to altitude, about half of people will suffer from acute mountain sickness. Now, the two slightly more serious conditions are high-altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, and high-altitude pulmonary edema, or HAPE. And both of these conditions are caused by a build-up of fluid, either on the brain for HACE or on the lungs for HAPE. Now, these conditions are different to AMS because they're life-threatening. So in these conditions, you can't just sit there and do nothing. You have to actually try to actively manage that treatment, manage those conditions. And we'll talk a little bit more, I'm sure, later on about what to do in emergency situations. But again, these conditions are possible on Mount Kilimanjaro. In fact, that's one of the mountains which has some of the highest incidence rates. And about 10% or so of the people that climb Kili will have those more serious conditions.
Okay, that's really interesting. So I think it's very important then to be able to identify, or is there a way to identify people who may be at risk of acute mountain sickness? I mean, is there predictors that one could look for before they even get to Kilimanjaro?
I don't think there's specific predictors that you can really use before you actually go out onto an expedition. There are some risk factors that we are aware of. We know that fast ascent increases risk. We know that lots of physical activity and strenuous physical activity increases risk of HAPE. We know that previous history of having acute mountain sickness is a problem. So if you've had acute mountain sickness before, like I have, then I'm always going to get it when I go to altitude. And there are some anthropometric and demographic issues. For example, if you're overweight, then that may increase your risk. If you're of male gender, if you are of a different age, then that may have an increased risk. But there's little you can do about your gender and your age, so that's not really something to focus on. But you could do something potentially about being overweight. You could reduce your risk there. So a better approach, rather than try to come up with all these risk factors, is just to identify and manage the actual conditions on the expedition.
Okay, fantastic. Sam, do you have anything to add there?
Just going to add, so I mentioned coughs and colds earlier on, and from our own research, we know that if you have some cold symptoms, that you're more likely to suffer from AMS afterwards. So again, trying to prevent coughs and colds with good hand washing and hygiene and managing the coughs and colds, so using paracetamol and those sorts of things, that can help reduce the likelihood of you getting acute mountain sickness. So we need to, although we often think about altitude illnesses a lot, there's lots of other health concerns just generally around an expedition environment that people should look to manage well, like the hygiene and eating well and things, to prevent people getting to the point where they're probably more at risk of altitude illness.
Okay. And Jamie, I know that you have some things to add related to that, so perhaps if you can share some of your insight on that.
So yes, I agree with what Sam's saying there, and one of the common questions that people have is how do you know, or how can you tell when someone's moving from mild and moderate acute mountain sickness, which should just resolve itself, but how do you know when things are becoming more serious and someone's progressing towards HACE and HAPE? And there's a couple of symptoms you can look out for. One is that with HACE we tend to see altered brain function. People may become ataxic, so they have difficulty walking. They may become confused, and they may blur their speech. So anything that sort of points towards an altered state of consciousness would be a concern. So you don't need any fancy machines to look at that. You can just observe people. With pulmonary edema, typically we're looking for people struggling to breathe, so they have breathlessness, especially on exertion, but sometimes even at rest, and any signs that they're struggling to get oxygen into their bodies, so if they're turning with blue lips or anything like that. But those are the type of symptoms we'd actually look out for. Another great tip to help people to actually monitor their symptoms and keep an eye on things is to use something called the Lake Louise Questionnaire. So this is a paper exercise that people can do every morning on the trek. They can start it a couple of days before they actually go to altitude, so they get used to answering 2 or 3 simple questions about their symptoms, how much headache they've got, how much nausea, whether their sleep's been disrupted, if they're feeling dizzy, if they're feeling tired. And those simple questions will actually begin to help you to monitor your own illnesses and help you to make decisions as you come to summit day on Kili about whether you should actually continue to ascend to the summit or whether you should turn around and go back down.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Jamie. So for all the viewers at home, I will actually put a link to the Lake Louise questionnaire in the bottom in the comments, in the description section of the video. Okay, so moving on then. So we've talked about how severe acute mountain sickness can be. So really, the literature seems to suggest the use of acetazolamide or Diamox. Now, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this, because this is quite a controversial issue, isn't it? So, I mean, my question here was going to be, when should it be taken and for how long? But I'm going to pose the question to you, Jamie. Should we even take it?
Well, our philosophy and advice that we have here is that you don't need to prophylactically use acetazolamide when you're climbing at altitude, providing that you have best practice in terms of your ascent rates, and you have flexibility in your program so that if people do get sick, you can actually manage that. We don't believe that you actually need to take it. And that's a philosophical standpoint, because we believe in trying to do activity and exercise without a pharmacological enhancement, but it's also from a physiological standpoint as well. As sports scientists, we're very aware that if you take acetazolamide, it can actually decrease your exercise capacity. So the last thing that we would want to do when people are going into an environment which is going to be physically arduous and challenging is try to make that exercise feel harder for them. So that's the principal reason why we don't take it ourselves, and we don't recommend other people to take it. There is a side effect profile associated with the drug. About 20% of people will suffer from symptoms, but those symptoms are actually quite mild. It's more the philosophical and the physiological reasons that we're concerned about, which mean that we wouldn't recommend you take it. Having said that, we are aware that people do ignore that advice, and they will continue to take the drugs prophylactically. And if that's the case, then do get in touch with us, because we can give you best practice advice on how to do that, or speak to a medical personnel. Your GP may not have this knowledge, but a GP combined with some of our advice together, you would be able to follow best practice if you were desperate to take these drugs.
Okay, so I suppose some of my next questions might be redundant about dosage and whatnot. I mean, if there is a person who does want to take Diamox and ignores the kind of advice that's just been given, what kind of dosage would you kind of advise them to start, and how long before should they take the Diamox?
So you have to remember that actually the indications for this drug are not to treat acute mountain sickness. It's actually indicated to treat other conditions like glaucoma. So the dosages are not completely understood, but we understand at the moment that if you're taking quite low doses of 125 mg twice per day, it's probably sufficient. You can take much more, up to 750, but there's no perceived benefit of that, and there are associated greater side effects as well. So typically a doctor would recommend a dose of around 125 mg per day. And what we would suggest is that if you are desperate to take it, you actually try taking it in the UK before you travel, because then you can understand side effects. If you are going to have any serious adverse reaction to it, you can do it in an environment where there's access to good medical facilities. We would definitely not recommend you take it for the first time on your first day when climbing Kilimanjaro. Then it's probably worth taking for a couple of days before you actually get onto the mountain, so it can begin to have an effect. And unfortunately, if you do take it, you're going to need to take it for the entire expedition. We've got some evidence that suggests that if you remove it during the expedition because you feel that you're acclimatized, you can actually have some negative effects at that point.
Okay, very interesting. Now, I just wanted to kind of add a little bit about what Jamie has been saying about the physiology. So essentially, acetazolamide or Diamox actually inhibits the bicarbonate buffering of carbon dioxide. It inhibits an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. And so you get a buildup of CO2 within the tissues of the body, and that can increase the amount of hydrogen, and then you start to get fatigue. So, one of the main reasons why you would avoid taking the drug is so that you don't get this fatigue that is associated with a buildup of CO2 in the tissues. So I suppose, Sam, I'm going to come to you now and ask really about, well, if you can't take Diamox, in terms of pre-preparation before you get to Kilimanjaro, how important is high cardiovascular fitness?
Just before I answer that question, just so we're really clear for everyone at home, we've been talking about taking Diamox or acetazolamide prophylactically, so this means before actually going on an expedition to high altitude. Acetazolamide is recommended for the treatment of some high altitude illnesses, so it's just to make it clear that we're not necessarily suggesting acetazolamide is a bad thing always. We're just saying that the idea of taking it before prophylactically, before you're actually got any illness, we don't recommend here. So one thing we do recommend here, though, and to answer your question, is that becoming more fit is going to give you a lot of advantages at altitude. So simply the fitter you are, you're going to find the trekking and the physical arduous exercise that you get on a trek easier. And that feeling of ease, obviously, is also going to be well linked to enjoying your trip of a lifetime more. I think becoming cardiovascularly fit is, so having good aerobic capacity, being able to have good endurance is important, because the days can be quite long. And also when we go to altitude, our aerobic capacity is reduced. So it means that days, even that are relatively short, days of endurance exercise can feel much more arduous even for fit people. In addition to that, remember you're carrying a rucksack. That's something that most of us don't do normally day to day, and also the boots that you may be wearing can be quite heavy. So I would also recommend some strength exercise training as well, alongside some endurance type training that is specific to carrying a rucksack. So the ideal situation would be to come up to somewhere like North Wales, go walking in the mountains so you get used to that rocky, uneven ground, using a rucksack for prolonged periods of time. Clearly, not everyone's going to be able to do that, but trying to do something that's as specific as possible, like walking, jogging for as longer periods as you can manage within your busy schedule, is going to be beneficial. And I really encourage wearing a rucksack, and the rucksack you're going to use on Kili day to day, so you get used to it and it fits you well and you don't get backache and problems associated with that. And the same way, wear your boots in so they're comfortable for you. You're not getting blisters and things like that. It's the things like blisters, coughs and colds, the things that we don't think about that are more likely to affect more people and actually have a negative effect on your enjoyment of your trek. So The only other thing I will add to high cardiovascular fitness, the literature would suggest that at times being highly trained may actually be a negative thing, and you may be more likely to get acute mountain sickness or altitude illnesses. It's probably a misunderstood concept. The likelihood is that people who are highly trained are they're physically able to ascend mountains more quickly. And if you can ascend a mountain more quickly, as we've been discussing, you're more likely to suffer from altitude illness. So although I would recommend that people train before they go away, and that being high fit is a good thing, people who are high fit should be aware that this is a powerful tool and that they need to use their fitness wisely and still keep using the recommended ascent rates of 300 meters per day over 3,000 meters, rule of sort of thumbs, to ensure that they're not ascending too quickly and putting themselves at risk of altitude illness, even though they're high fit.
Perfect. Okay, thank you for that, Sam. And Jamie, what's your opinion on the kind of, obviously we know from Sam you've got to be highly aerobically fit. What's your opinions on that?
Yeah, I completely agree with Sam's point of view. I was very pleased that Sam mentioned that you do need to move slowly once you're in the environment. And in fact, when you're on Kili, the guides and the porters are experienced with this, and it can be quite frustrating as a trekker. You feel that they're moving almost too slowly and want to get going, but you really do need to follow that advice. If you want to stay well, I'd stay behind them.
Perfect, excellent advice. Okay, so that's all for this part at the moment. Please join us again for part 2 soon. Thank you.